Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Sophie in the Saddle by Dick King Smith. Chapter 4. Bumblebee. Sophie plodded back with a face like thunder. She arrived at the same time as the twins, who came racing up and threw themselves across an imaginary fishing line, completely destroying Sophie's sand farm. Sophie didn't even notice. "Guess who I've just seen?" she said in tones of deepest gloom. "Haven't a clue," said her father. "Someone from school," said Sophie. "Someone you don't much like, by the look of you," said her mother. "I know," said Mark. "I know what you're going to say," said Matthew. "Don!" they shouted. "Oh no," said her parents. "Oh yes," said Sophie. "She's just along the beach with her horrible mum and her horrible dad." How do you know they're horrible?" "Well, they had Don, didn't they?" "I think you should try to be nicer to poor Don," said Sophie's mother. "She can't be all that bad." "Yuck," said Sophie. Long, long ago, Don had deliberately squashed one of the largest of Sophie's herd of wood lice, and Sophie had neither forgotten nor forgiven. The twins looked slyly at one another and grinned. "Now you've got someone to play with," they said with one voice. Sophie turned an angry face upon them and then saw the wreck of her sand farm. "Look what you've done!" she shouted. "You're mouldy, stupid, and passive, you are!" And she charged furiously at them, but they ran away, laughing. "Calm down, Sophie," said her father. "I'll help you build another one." "I don't want to build another one." "Well, let's go and have another bath." "I don't want another bath." "Or throw sticks into the sea for Puddle." "Don't want to." "Well, what do you want then?" "I want to go back to the farm." "Not yet," said her father. "This weather's too good to miss. We shan't be going for hours yet." "Cheer up, Sophie, darling," said her mother. "Let's have our picnic lunch." "Not hungry," said Sophie. But in fact, she found she was, and she was still eating when everyone else was full. And afterwards, Matthew and Mark helped her to build a simply enormous sand castle and dug tunnels through it, and decorated it with seaweed and shells and pebbles, and finally wrote in the sand with a piece of driftwood, "Sophie's Castle, keep out." "And put trespassers will be persecuted," said Sophie. "Prosecuted," said her father. "Yes, and prosecuted too," said Sophie. "Like that Don ought to be for coming on our beach." This gave her an idea, and she took the piece of driftwood and went along to the big sticking up rock cautiously in case they were still there. But they weren't, so Sophie wrote in the sand in huge letters, "Go home, Hom, Don." That'll scare her, she thought. She never saw me, so it'll be really spooky for her to see her name there tomorrow. And at the end of the day, Sophie went home much happier. while the incoming tide crept up the beach and washed out her message. By bedtime, Sophie had quite recovered her spirits. She had been allowed to feed me Blong Joe and had helped pick up the eggs in the hen house. She had spoken to some sheep and chatted to some cows. And finally, Joe had taken her round the stables and showed her some of the ponies, for the next day Sophie was to have her first riding lesson. I expect my mum will put you up on this one, Joe said, stroking the velvety muzzle of a grey pony that was looking out over the half door of its box. She's called Bumblebee. She's a beginner's pony. She's got a nice face, said Sophie. She's as quiet as an old sheep, said Joe. She's as quiet as an old sheep, said Joe's mother the next morning as she saddled up Bumblebee. Sophie's father and the twins had gone to the beach while her mother stayed behind to watch the first lesson. Only one thing Bumblebee doesn't like, said the farmer's wife, and that's pigs, which is one reason why we don't keep any apart from that ugly old creature of Joe's. Why doesn't she like pigs? Asked Sophie. A person who didn't like pigs would be foolish, she thought, so perhaps this was a foolish horse. Some horses are funny about things, the farmer's wife said. We had a pony that was frightened stiff of the local bus. Go mad, he would, if the bus came along. And another that hated going through gateways. Bumblebee, she can't stand pigs. Now then, Sophie, ever been on a horse before? No, said Sophie, but I'm going to be a lady farmer, so I shall have to know how to ride a horse round my flocks and herds. A lady farmer, eh? Not going to have a man about the place, then? I might, said Sophie. I might marry Andrew, but only if he's got a farm. If he hasn't, I shan't. You bain't so green as you cabbage looking, as we say round these parts, said the farmer's wife. Now then, let's get you up. You're not nervous, are you? No, said Sophie. She was, a tiny bit, but she wasn't going to say so. All the same, it felt very odd once she was sitting on Bumblebee's back. The pony was not a big one, but it did seem to Sophie that she was rather a long way from the ground. Joe's mother showed her how to hold the reins and how her feet should be in the irons. Toes to heaven, heels to hell, and told her to sit up straight and to keep her hands low. Then she said, Now, all we're going to do is to walk along nice and quiet with me holding the leading rein. Ready? Just a minute, said Sophie's mother, and she got out her camera to take a picture of stocky Sophie sitting on stocky Bumblebee. Geez, Sophie, she cried, but Sophie's face was grimly determined under the hard hat. The cap I gave her looks a bit small, the farmer's wife said. Joe's would fit her better, I think. And she called, Joe! Yes, came a voice from the far side of the yard. Can you come here a minute, please? Quickly! Joe was in the pigsty, scratching the bristly back of her Vietnamese pot-bellied pet, who had lowered himself a few inches to lie blissfully on his fat stomach. Stay there, me Blong Joe, she said. Shan't be half a tick. And she ran out of the sty. She pulled the door to, but did not bother to latch it. Slowly, it swung open again. The procession had only just started out. The farmer's wife leading Bumblebee, Sophie, now wearing Joe's hat, sitting as straight as a ramrod, her mother walking behind, when round the corner came the small, fat, bristly black shape of me Blong Joe, squeaking happily to himself at this unexpected freedom. Bumblebee let out a shrill neigh of horror and sheered violently, and Sophie came off with a thump. Her mother rushed to her. "It's all right, darling," she said. "Don't cry." "I'm not," said Sophie. Sophie did not approve of crying. "Get that pig of yours out of here, Joe!" shouted the farmer's wife angrily, and to Sophie she said, "Have you hurt yourself?" "No," said Sophie. She had a tiny bit, but she wasn't going to say so. "Perhaps we'd better leave it at that for today," her mother said. "No," said Sophie. "I want to have another go." "She's quite right," said the farmer's wife. She lowered her voice. "Best thing to do, get straight on again," she murmured. "Otherwise, she might lose her nerve." Sophie's mother smiled. "Not Sophie," she said. "Come on then," said the farmer's wife. "Up we go." "Can I say something to Bumblebee first?" Sophie said. "Of course, if you want to." Sophie plodded round and reached up to the grey pony's head and stroked her nose. "Now then, my dear," she said, "you listen to me. The P-I-G has gone, so there's no need to be frightened any more." "I thought I'd better spell it," she said once she was astride again. "You never know how much animals can understand." "No doubt about it," said the farmer's wife to Sophie's mother. "She's going to be a proper lady farmer, she is. Walk on."